Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's a Ukraine war update for the 1st of June 2023. Sorry it's a little bit late. I recorded this entire video and it turns out my computer was really struggling and every time I was moving the map I was freezing and it was unwatchable. It's horrible. Anyway, I restarted the computer and here goes. Anyway, we'll go first of all to, instead of going to the northeast sector of our front line, let's go and look at the border, the northern border of Ukraine around Kharkiv. Belgorod to the north in Russia, where it appears that the Freedom Russia Legion, I think possibly the other group of Russian volunteers, has crossed into Russia from Ukraine again, currently involved in heavy battles against the Russian army in the village of Novaya Tavolzhanka and Shebekino in the Belgorod region. I think there are Russian claims that they've kind of repelled this and so on and so forth. So I'll try and work out what's been going on over the course of today. There have been further claims to the video I showed earlier today in my news piece that here it says Special Question Cat says Legion of Freedom of Russia claims the destruction of the Russian MLRS Grad, so Grad launcher, but the footage is filmed from too far away to confirm that. That has been geolocated to the same position of the previous footage. And what was the previous footage? Well, I this morning a Kamaz truck with ammunition as well as a self-propelled mortar getting taken out in that area of Belgorod, Shebekino. We'll put that into Google Maps and see exactly where that is. And there we go. It is up in the Belgorod region, not too far from Kharkiv. And there you go. So that map on Visegrad here gives you an indication of Novaya Tavolzhanka, and then up here Shebekino, Novaya Tavolzhanka and Shebekino, and that geolocation is kind of south of Shebekino. There's been this border crossing, I think there is what was targeted by drone activity, and the Russians claim that it wasn't damaged, but it appears to have been damaged. There's some 6 or so drones, I think, that were sent against that. So you can see that activity is indeed taking place in this area. On the one hand, I mean, talk about what are they hoping to gain from this, those Russian units, volunteer units, but they clearly are being supplied by the Ukrainians. They've got Max Pros and Humvees and whatnot, and you know, their small arms equipment, so on and so forth. And I think in the previous incursions, it wasn't just about worrying the Russians, wondering whether they had good enough defenses, fixing troops there and all that kind of stuff, messing with morale. Actually, I think they had particular objectives, so that some electronic warfare equipment was taken, which was hugely high value. It's one of these like truck setups that would have had some technical equipment on board that the Ukrainians would have really liked to have got their hands on. And so stuff like that, I think, was actually the objective, and you can dress it up in all these other activities. It's happened again here. We wonder whether there are other things that they were aiming for, as well as taking out those sort of mortar and other bits of equipment there. But the Russians have themselves attacked in the area. If we go to I'm just trying to remember where it is in the ISW. There were claims that, here it is, Ukrainian General Staff reported that Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group attempted to infiltrate Ukrainian lines near Zeleny, northeast of Kharkiv city, Kharkiv Oblast, for the 2nd consecutive day. So Kharkiv is here, so rather than being over here where the Ukrainian pro-Ukrainian Russians are working, this is going to be to the northeast, sorry, I'll get my compass correct, in the area of Zeleny. I'm not 100% sure where that is, but that's going to be somewhere over here. Anyway, so the Russians are attacking somewhere along this part of the border, and the Ukrainians are attacking it over there. So 6 of one, half a dozen of the other to some degree. Right, okay, we'll come down to the Kupiansk-Kreminna front line. The claims here, if we look at Poulet Volon, who has maps of the area, it actually is more down the Kreminna area by the forest that there's activity reported here. No reports of the area. We'll go start with the Liman Pershi because that's further up north. There is activity, it appears, in Liman Pershi, Mazyativka area. Sorry, my fingers actually worked like I want them to. I could operate this thing well. Little happens on the front except around Bilohorivka. We'll get there in a second. And north of Kupiansk, that's where we are there. Russian troops made some territorial gains north of Bilohorivka, but this has since been reversed by the Ukrainian counterattack. Fighting continues around Kupiansk, south of Masyativka towards Sinkivka. Activity still going on there. We heard yesterday that there were no fortifications, built-in fortifications in that whole area, and that means it's quite difficult for the Russians to stay there, in kind of semi-permanent capacity. They kind of have to move in and then move back, but they do supposedly control that area. Now going down to this area around Bilohorivka, it appears that the Ukrainians took some ground there after Russians had taken it. So there's a bit of to and fro in the area. Just seeing they say anything about that. But no, just that part about it being reversed by the Ukrainian counterattack. Okay, we go to look at what's going on here from point of view of the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank. Russian and Ukrainian forces engaged in 13 clashes in the Kupiansk and Kreminna directions. It's a little bit of an uptick from the kind of previous week, but in the whole scheme of things, that's not very much at all. If you remember when I was talking about Ploshchanka, Chivona, Popivka, Terny, Tulsk, all these places all the time getting repelled attacks and incursions and whatnot into enemy lines from both sides. Now we're having 13 up and down the entire axis there. It's a very small amount of activity. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces repelled Russian ground attacks northwest of Sratov in Mazyativka, Novoselivka and Stelmakivka. I talked to you about that yesterday, how the Russians were repelled from that Kuzumivka area and Stelmakivka here. That they attacked and then took some ground near Stelmakivka, but then were forced back, and the Ukrainians retook the ground and the Russians ran away, convict troops particularly. The same happened in Kuzumivka, where they didn't take any ground, they were just thoroughly repelled with the use of Ukrainian artillery, indirect fire, direct fire from tanks, so artillery, tanks, drones, small arms, a whole lot there set against the Russians, and the Russians capitulated in their attempted attack. And there's been this talk about how the Russians are mounting some kind of offensive as they are pushing in a number of places up and down this axis, Bilohorivka, Stelmakivka, Kuzumivka, Mazyativka, and so on and so forth. So that's led certain people, like here's NW reports, New World Economics does mapping like me, but sits pretty much, I think, slightly pro-Russian, and I think you can read that from this. I'm really interested to see what you think about this, because I've got my big old criticisms coming on. So I think Russia's capabilities, he says, to hide their capabilities from an OSINT analyst like Kaufman are better than Kaufman thinks. So Michael Kaufman's a really good analyst. Probably knows a good sight more than me and NW War Reports combined. I say that with all due respect to Kaufman. Yeah, I think he's a smart guy for sure. To elaborate further, I think the Russians were in real trouble after the events of the Ukrainian fall offensives. Yep, the autumn offensives didn't amount to anything. Russians seem to have culminated. They were in trouble. I'd agree. But then this is where it becomes a bit fanciful. But I think they have used the winter to rebuild a lot of the capabilities they lost that last year. Okay, where's the evidence for that? Capabilities of what? What manpower? What training's taking place? What better equipment is being brought into bear? In the meantime, they shifted the workload to a private contractor. I think viewing the winter fighting season as the Russians just barely clinging on is a huge mistake. Could it be that the Russians had taken forces back and are properly training them and have been for 6 months? I don't know. Is there any evidence of that? The Russian army launched some failed operations, but they were relatively small in scale. So the question here is, if Russia are the second greatest army in the world, and if they are what are they doing in Ukraine? If they're not there to actually take land, are they there just defensively now? Why would they have small-scale failed attacks? Which is what NWE seems to be claiming here. Yeah, they had some small-scale attacks and they failed in the autumn. Well, yeah, is Is that all they can do? Surely, if you had the capability of mounting series of attacks, you would do that. Otherwise, what's the point in being there? You'd surely try and achieve the most you possibly can rather than trying to achieve the least you possibly can. I'm not quite sure of the reasoning going on here. With all due respect, uh, the Russian army had launched some failed operations, but they're relatively small in scale. I do not think it's a stretch to say that Russians have prepared a similar force to the one that entered Ukraine in February 2022 with fresh troops and modern equipment. We have seen they have this. I don't know what footage he this is that he is using. I don't know when that's from. Is this just paper bear? Some new tanks that are being brought to bear? Have these got fire support in them? Yeah. When was this film? I'd really like to know if you guys know about this footage. What does it represent? What do you think these tanks are? Do you think these are full of decent tech, so on and so forth? Why haven't they brought them to bear already? What's going on? Are they going to hit Ukraine with a an offensive that has not been particularly predicted? Is that why the Ukrainians are holding on for their own counteroffensive? I think that's much more to do with the right timing and the weather and etc. etc. Is it realistic to think that Russia do have a huge force to the same tune as what they had in February 2022? After all they've lost and been apparently unable to replace, you think that they've just been waiting all this time, a whole year, to wait to get up to a level that they were at previously? All the losses in troops, expertise, and equipment, I don't know that that's at all realistic. And then you go on to what Suryak Map says, who does no mapping updates, but has said this. And again, I'm interested to see what you think. After 2 weeks since the end of the battle, pro-Russian map of this, for Bakhmut, the battle for Donbass is close to restarting fiercely. New Russian reinforcements are arriving to the Eastern Front in order to continue the offensive operations. In recent days, many people have been wondering where. The new Russian offensive. Right, first of all, this is really problematic. So when you come to look at what the ISW says of Bakhmut, one of the things they add in here is I think really significant. Geolocated footage published on May the 31st shows the irregular formation of 1st Wolves Sabotage and Reconnaissance Brigade, previously active in the Avdiivka area, operating near Zalizhnyansky, so that's north of Bakhmut. So we've got geolocated footage showing these guys working in north of Bakhmut. Now, these guys were previously in Avdiivka, so they had been drafted from Avdiivka to Bakhmut. This unit's presence near Zalizhnyansky supports ISW's assessment that Russian forces are likely transferring irregular forces and DNR elements from the Avdiivka area to the Bakhmut area. In other words, when Suryak Maps here is saying there's going to be this new offensive from the Russians, and he's talking about Avdiivka being one of them, we'll come on to that. Well, they're taking troops from Avdiivka, and we know that for sure, and placing them in Bakhmut, because Bakhmut is fixing the intention is to fix the Russian troops there and draft in Russian reserves so that you're weaker elsewhere. So why would you do that and then make claims or make intentions to attack at Avdiivka? You're removing your troops from Avdiivka to attack at Avdiivka. It seems entirely incongruous. Anyway, so Suryak says, in recent days, many people have been wondering where in the new Russian offensive would take place, where the new Russian offensive would take place, and everything seems to indicate that it will take place. The answer is that it will take place in different areas. First of all, we have Belgorod. During the last days, the Russian army has increased their attacks around the town from the forest area at the northern shore of the Donetsk River and from the east close to the filtration plant. The objective is the development of a pincer movement to force Ukrainians, which are strongly entrenched there, to leave the town. The objective is not the beginning of an offensive towards Seversk, but leveling the front line and keeping fighting as far away as possible from Lysychansk. Now, this again is bizarre. So here we have the idea is to level the front line. I don't know whether that means here or the whole level there. I mean, it's going to include Bakhmut and Avdiivka, leveling it. which, well, I'll come on to my massive criticism in a second. But as far as Bilahorivka is concerned, yes, there have been attacks, but the Ukrainians have counterattacked and regained land there. If the Russians are going to do a counterattack here, they need to do a proper big one, right? Not just doing what they've done over the last 10 months here still. So, before I blast apart what I think is the issue here, let me continue. The objective is not the beginning of an offensive towards Seversk, but leveling the front line, keeping fighting away from Lysychansk. The second place is the entire front line situated in Ocheretsnye and Marinka Hromadas. In this long front line, the Russian army will continue the attrition war by advancing slowly towards the Ukrainian defensives, trying to develop the encirclement over Avdiivka, probably the next important battle of the war. Increasing the buffer zone west of Donetsk city by continuing advancing in Marinka, Pervomaisky, and Novelsky. On the other hand, Ukrainian army will continue the preparations of the offensive in the southern front, but also will continue to defend the Donbass under its control by shifting part of these resources eastward, which might affect the start of the offensive, unlikely to take place during the rest of the spring. Just nuts, that claim. I've just had some noodles placed by me. Amazing. This is a nuts claim, right? What Syriac Maps is saying is that the new Russian offensive is going to be, wait for it, attacking Bilahorivka, attacking Bakhmut, attacking Adiivka, and attacking Marinka, which is what they've been doing for 11 months and haven't got anywhere. They're just about taken Bakhmut, but now the Ukrainians are successfully fixing the Russians in place there. They've not succeeded at all in Avdiivka or Marinka, like marginally at most. And Bilahorivka is holding out as it has done for months. This is just really bizarre thinking to say that, yeah, okay, the new Russian new Russian offensive is exactly what the offensive has been for the last 10 months. I would show you a clip of Blackadder Goes Forth, the fourth series of Blackadder, where it's like, this is exact, General Melchett says, this is exactly what the Hun would think we were going to do. It's like, sir, we've attacked this place 17 times previously. Yes, we'll attack it one more time, exactly what they don't think we'll do. Just like kind of hilariously bad reasoning is what is going on here. Anyway, that's just dipping into a couple of more sort of pro-Russian thinkers, and I just would like to know what you think about those claims that they have. Anyway, moving on now to Bakhmut, we'll go back to ISW, Institute for the Study of War, American Military Think Tank. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces aim to capture Kremova. This again makes me laugh. To set conditions for future efforts to advance in the Kramatorsk direction. Okay, let's go and look at the Bakhmut map. Here we have Bakhmut, and we have Kremovas, this tiny little village that is sort of keeping the Russians hemmed in Bakhmut. And as if like taking Kremova will set the conditions for taking Kramatorsk. I mean, what about Chaziv Yar? What about Druzhkivka? What about Malotoranivka? Like, what are you talking about? Setting the conditions by taking Kremova. Taking Kremova will set the conditions for taking Kramatorsk. Well, I guess you're not going to take Kramatorsk if you ain't got Kremova, but seriously. Anyway, Russian forces have increased artillery strikes in this direction. Geolocated footage, I've talked about that. So that's the idea that that they are drafting in troops from Adiivka to help support Bakhmut. Right. If we are going to look at Bakhmut, Poulet-Volon has no mapping of Bakhmut. There are no changes from any of the mappers. Remember, the yellow is a pro-Ukrainian mapper, deep state map. Blue, Andrew Perpetua, pro-Ukrainian, and red is pro-Russian mapper, Syriac Maps, and they all seem to fairly much agree. All of these lines represent Russian positions. Elsewhere, the blue line represents the defensive positions for the Ukrainians, or offensive, depending on where they are and what's going on. But here, it's the Russian lines for all three mappers, and they broadly agree everywhere, apart from significantly here, I'm going to talk about that in a second, and somewhat around Klishchivka, but none of them have changed their mapping yesterday. So there seems to be some kind of stasis or operational security. We just don't know what's going on. There is lots of footage coming out of activity, although I didn't see any coming out last night from the day before. So Defmon says that the Ukrainian forces are now shooting fish in the Bakhmut barrel. Here we have the idea that the Russians are now safely ensconced in the kind of territory of the city of Bakhmut itself. And that means that the Ukrainians know where they are and are just going to hammer them with artillery. And that is what they're doing, and apparently quite successfully so, at least according to some Ukrainian sources. In fact, there's several bits of footage here. Ukrainian artillery is targeting a house where the enemy is entrenched in Bakhmut. And again, same kind of stuff, destruction of buildings with Russian soldiers in. Then we have this goes back to that mapping I was telling you about. So Defense Ministry, southwestern outskirts of Bakhmut remain in Ukrainian control. The southwestern outskirts of Bakhmut and the entrance to the city remain in control of the Ukrainian forces, Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said yesterday. According to Maliar, the offensive activity with the Russian forces in Bakhmut has been halted. However, Russian forces have increased the frequency of artillery shelling, indicating a change in tactics. Well, I'll be damned. So the claim here is that the Ukrainians still have some kind of foothold in the southwestern outskirts of Bakhmut. That can only really be here. We know that the Russians have been here, although those buildings have been taken out both initially by the Russians and then by the Ukrainians, I believe. It could be in this area where Syriac Maps has the Russians controlling, but the other two mappers differ. It could be that Ukrainians are holding out there and somewhere in that region, but it's amazing to think that they are still holding out. I mean, the Ukrainians have been consistent with their claims here that they have, soldiers with a foothold in that area. Now we're going to go to look at some footage concerning this E40 road out of Bakhmut to the north, and that goes out towards Privilia. Now we're going to look at it in the area that's under Russian control. Here, this footage suggests that the Russians are being pretty much hammered along that road. So this source says, over the past week, Ukrainian FPV first-person view loitering munitions have swarmed the E40 north of Bakhmut, destroying a number of Russian vehicles, attempting to resupply the salient in Dubovo, Vasilivka and Bakhivka. A striking story on the strategic use of the FPV loitering drones or munitions, and he has a thread. So this is what's going on, and we've seen a number of these, the Bakanka trucks, the little Scooby-Doo vans, little vans, other trucks, Kamaz, whatever. They appear to be very deliberately striking logistics that are supplying the troops on those front lines with ammunition, food, medical supplies, all those kind of things. This is making life difficult for the Russians in the area for sure. These are Escadrone drones. I know that there's a UK manufacturer that has similar types of drones, and I'll talk about them in a second. Now, here's a map of the carnage along the E40. Ukrainian FPV loitering munitions are ranging deep behind Russian lines, hitting essential transport links in an environment that should have heavy anti-drone jamming and air defense assets in place. Now, we know that the UK ones that are similar to these Escadrone ones have a terminal setting that means that when they are really close to hitting their target, even if they're jammed, they can switch kind of guidance and whatever and still hit the target. So whether these Escadrone ones have the same capability, I don't know, but jamming is not working on them, evidently. Strike on so some of the examples here: strike on a Russian convoy hitting a Kamaz cargo truck, a Bukanka on the E40, that's a Scooby-Doo van, a cargo van right off the E40, another pair of hits on a Russian cargo van and an SUV further down the E40. Ukrainian forces are most likely causing a significant level of disruption to Russian forces attempting to supply the salient in the Dubovo, Vasilivka and Bakhivka area without wasting valuable precision-guided munitions like Excalibur HIMARS and JDAM ER. I think this is really significant and a good move for the Ukrainians. I think, although we don't have any particular knowledge of territorial exchanges here, we know that the Ukrainians are really harassing the Russians, both in terms of attacking them along these fronts, but also hitting their artillery and hitting their logistics lines as well. Okay, let's go on to look at Adiivka. We're going to go further down south. As I say, there will be activity going on along those flanks, but we just don't have too much knowledge of exchanges of territory. Right, as we come down to Adiivka, the blue line goes back to being a regular blue line, and it's really only the yellow of deep state map and the red of Suryat maps that are the defensive lines of the Russians. When we look at Avdiivka, we have pro-Russian source Rebar. The only frontline activity they talk about is in Avdiivka and Marinka. Avdiivka, fierce fighting is taking place on both the northern and southern flanks. Russian rocket artillery strikes are launched on detected Ukrainian positions. Here, there's also some footage in Adiivka. I meant to show you this yesterday, maybe even the day before. A group of Ukrainian operators from the 3rd Separate Special Purpose Regiment hit a Russian T-62 from behind with an NLAW. And you can see NLAW, which is a top attack, British-made, although with Saab. Actually, that doesn't look to be the top attack mode. That seems to be just hitting it in the rear there, straight up. There you go. I stand corrected on how they used that there. Okay, that's activity in that region. Now, the ISW says a Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces conducted ground attacks from Kamyanka and advanced to new positions there. This is probably reflecting the news from yesterday, which is that the Russians took some ground there. So I don't think that's actually from the last 24 hours. Remember, the ISW compiles stuff from my time the night before, so it's the morning after they've compiled that, and that refers for them to 24 to often to 48 hours previously. So some of it might not have happened within the last 24 hours when you're listening to this video. Okay, we also have that claims that the ISW hasn't observed those advances, but I think that's being confirmed by other mappers. Another mill blogger claimed that skirmishes continued near Vodzyanye. Now, Vodzyanye is here. There was some mapping differences. The pro-Ukrainian map, a deep state map, shows that the Russians have been pushed back north of Opitny here. So there could be some Ukrainian counterattacks in the area, maybe shelling to push the Russians back. I don't know exactly what the details are. But when you look at Suryat Maps claims that, hey, they're going to be attacking in Severny and Pervomarsky and Novelsky and whatever, is going to be their counterattacks. Again, this is exactly what they're doing. They're doing it every day and they're not getting anywhere. So, yeah, not really sure what to say other than Marinka, where there is continuing attacks there. Rebar, the pro-Russian source, says in Marinka, positional fighting continues in the low-rise buildings near Drisby Avenue. From time to time, the Ukrainians attempt counterattacks, which are countered by Russian artillery fire, and the Ukrainians claim that the Russians do counterattacks themselves. So there's fighting still near Drisby. Remember, Drisby was a front line, this main road going through the middle of Marinka. I say the middle, actually, most of Marinka is towards the southeast. But yeah, fighting is still near there at least. It hasn't progressed too much on in the last couple of weeks. And then as we come down from Marinka, we are moving on to this area near Vuhledar. We have seen activity from Novo-Mykolivka right down to Vuhledar Marivka. Here, Solodka, there's a pushback from the Ukrainians, a bit of a counterattack there that took back a bunch of ground. And indeed, when we look at other mappers like here, Andrew Perpetua says that actually there's a Ukrainian counterattack yesterday that took land back in the Volodymyrivka area, as well as what we saw previously north of Pavlivka, where the Russians have been pushed back to behind the river again, and it seems that they've been pushed back out of the dachas near Vuhledar. So the Ukrainians are counterattacking here, and I said the other day that it looks like their activity here is rather like Bakhmut, in that they're not drawing on counteroffensive from that counteroffensive pot. So these newly trained soldiers and new equipment that they've been given, that they seem to be doing counterattacks localized to the Vuhledar area that are similar to Bakhmut, using existent kind of reserves from the area and what they have. And because the Russians are exhausted, culminated, low morale, etc., and getting hammered behind the lines in terms of logistics with Storm Shadow and HIMARS, that this allows the Ukrainians to do this and still keeps their counteroffensive capability intact. That is really significant. If that is the case, it certainly appears the case to me, because I don't think there's any news of any new Ukrainian troops drafted to the area. And I think that's significant, because they're able to hurt the Russians without changing anything up particularly. Okay, going on to what the ISW says about the area. Geolocated footage posted on May the 31st shows artillery units hammering the Ukrainian positions near Novopil. And in fact, there's basically as we go to the west. So we move out here past Velika Novosilka, where there's activity there. The Russians are still trying to push into there, but it's really well defended, so they probably won't get anywhere. We come to Novopil, and there's just geolocated footage of the Ukrainians getting hit there by Russian artillery. And then further to the south here, there's evidence of the Russians getting hit. There are just artillery duels going on. So, here we have that geolocated attack of the Russians on the Ukrainians here in Novopil, just to give you a bit of geolocation joy. That is there. So that you can see that there's been geolocated activity there. And then here we have the Russians getting hit with a Russian soldier being evacuated there. And that has been geolocated to this position, which is slightly further to the southwest. And there, here we go. So artillery is taking place, happening, artillery duels. So I guess not too surprising. Anyway, when we come to Drozhnianka, people like Poulet Volant have maps that talk about that. Well, in fact, sorry, I missed their mapping of Pavlivka and Vuhledar, which I think is significant. So they agree with what Andrew Perpetua is claiming. In fact, possibly even more significant gains there. 17.2 square kilometers for the Ukrainians as they push the Russians. That does seem to be pushing into the grey area rather than pushing the Russians back. As you can see, when they push the Russians back, you have that kind of mapping, which is a hashed red area. And they were pushed back both into the Slodka area and just southwest of Pavlivka, where the Ukrainians made some gains. They are pushing the Ukrainians both east and west of Mikilska, but that's largely into the grey zone, I think, there. And then as Poulet-Volant comes further to the west, we have this area just south of Haliopole, where there is some gains that were made by the Ukrainians. Well, Andrew Perpetua also has that here. I don't know whether that's activity from the last 2 or 3 days or whether that has happened recently, but it seems like, as in yesterday, but it seems like Drozhnianka is under a bit of pressure. The Russians walked into Drozhnianka pretty much literally. There was no defenses set up there. This happened a couple of months back. I told you about it. And then the Ukrainians had to suddenly scramble together some forces to send them down to try and do something about that. It was one of those weird situations there where, like, there doesn't seem to be any Ukrainians here. We'll have that. And it showed like that was a great gain for the Russians, but actually it was kind of like a bit of a Mary Celeste situation. Anyway, that's the activity going on along the front line itself. The ISW does make some further claims that are worth dipping into here. Now, Russian forces continue to concentrate in southern Ukraine. Ukrainian Mariupol mayoral advisor reported that Russian forces are replacing old and worn equipment, including T-72 and T-62 tanks and air defenses in southern Ukraine. So I wonder where they're drawing that from. Is this new build? Are they actually able to build some of this stuff? Or, like sort of New World Economics was saying, or is this drawn from within Russian placements inside Russia, and maybe they're able to think that, okay, we can use that on the front lines or whatever. So also the claim is from the same advisor that Russian forces are moving equipment towards Manhush and Berdyansk out of fear of Ukrainian strikes on Mariupol, and geolocations confirm that they are indeed doing this. What does that mean? Well, Storm Shadow are absolutely hammering Mariupol. So they're moving equipment from Mariupol to Manhush and Berdyansk to make it safe. I don't know whether that's to spread it out because these places get hit as well. We've had continual hits of sites right along this coastline by Berdyansk, by Mariupol, so on and so forth. So I don't think moving it out of Mariupol is in itself a way to save that equipment, but it could be a way to spread it out. Right. And then lastly, the ISW says Russian MOD claimed yesterday that Russian forces destroyed the final Romanian Ukrainian warship in Odessa port. And that happened 3 days ago. Ukraine's Southern Operational Command reported on the 29th that Russian drone strikes had caused the fire at the port infrastructure in Odessa, but did not mention the warship. And there's no confirmation from ISW. But that's interesting. So the Ukrainian Navy is obviously, not a particularly sizable force anymore. They scuttled some ships, lost some ships, had many captured, Berdyansk and Mariupol and whatnot. And their last remaining warship might have been hit in Odessa. So Odessa was struck on the 29th. I did report that myself, but Ukrainians are very good at covering up what has been hit. If a military target has been hit, their operational security kicks in for obvious reasons, keeping the morale up, keeping intelligence up and tight. And so we don't always hear about the Ukrainian losses that do take place as a result of successful Russian strikes. And it might well be that a warship has been hit. But the government has made it, you can be punished for sharing certain types of footage, and it could be that the Ukrainians are just scared of doing so now. So there is that to take into account. Anyway, that's what's happened on the front line. I really appreciate you having patience while I put this together for a second time, and watching here. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care, and I'll speak to you in my update later.